you everyone for coming. I'm very happy to be here, especially because I love Oxford so much. Also for the support that I continue to get from Melissa, from Amy, and all my professors and mentors who taught me here in Mississippi. So I'm very happy to be back.
Can you read a couple of poems for us, and then we can just
Yes. So some of these poems, I think I always say that I'm grateful to Oxford for giving me some of the poems, or most of the poems in this book, and the other poems that you'll get to see in the future. Some of the poems in this collection was also part of my thesis that was supervised by Amy. And I guess some of you might have heard versions of this before, including Ellie Black and you know, because some of the poems I wrote them for class, and I workshop some of them. So enjoy. If this is your first time hearing me read a poem, today's your lucky day. Blue. The Mediterranean remains blue across centuries of swallowing. Because it is not a cemetery, it does not date its memories. On the sky is a diary that catalogues the bodies lost to the sea. In the language of a gong, water clashed against the rocks. An elegy to the fish that embalmed our dead inside their cold bodies. After the new millennium, I learned to forget what I cannot say. A seed vow was built outside a deserted city. Obscured with grief, I searched for familiar faces from the shadows on the walls. Now, every song in a foreign tongue sounds like a prayer. Cosmology of the cloud with Baba as the rainmaker. The sky was a rolag clouded with grief and dew. We were made in the image of our dead because God relied on recycling to keep the earth going around the sun. Each of my father's eyes was a globe of brown worms, or Google's palm cells swimming towards an egg in search for life. He no longer reads the Quran without his glasses. The ritual of whirling the first rain has no origin story. Today, the sky looked freshly molded from clay. I jumped into the rain with my hands raised to the sky. No one stays in it for long, so it doesn't unmake the scars on our heads, healing and almost forgotten. The puddles sometimes get large, it drags the child away. Everyone lost to the water was recovered without their eyes. That's how I know a fish loves to swallow whatever resembles a lamb. Prayer. I held the snowball in my hand when I heard the muezzin's call. Halfway in prayer, I doubted if this God could distinguish brown eyes. I worried less and sought intercession with the tongue I sing with. For the first time, I prayed in a new country, with the tongue I inherited from a dead man.
So, I wanted to ask you, I was trying to think of a way to get into talking about the scope of this book, and I thought I would start asking you about water and the color blue.
Yeah.
So that first poem you read is the first poem of the book, and it's called Blue, and it begins with this line, the Mediterranean remains blue across centuries of swallowing. And there's water in nearly every poem in this book.
Yes.
And the color blue is referred to a lot. So can you talk a little bit about that trope and what that offers you as a poet?
Thank you for that. So I wrote most of this book during COVID, and it was a time when I was so unsure about what's going to happen, because my friend, a roommate, would tell me, there's COVID everywhere, you know. And then he would say we shouldn't even go downstairs to the kitchen together because he suspect that maybe I have the COVID, or that maybe he has the COVID and then he would infect me with it. So at the time, it was so silent at that time because it was just everywhere was so we were so unsure about what's going on. And then I would sit in my room and then wonder what I can write about. So I decided I would write about. I never knew what I would write about, but I was trying to write about how the silence that surrounds the whole town at a time. And most of my poem, I would say, I break my poems out of silence. It's more like when things are so silent, or like I zone out of what's the noise, that's the best time for me to write. So I decided I would write about anything. And the closest I could think of is the water. And that's because to have water is a thing of privilege at a time, or some time in my life. And there's so many spiritual connotation to like what the water brings. There are people who do there are palmists in Nigeria, African mythology, where like a child is born, the first thing you need to start think about is what kind of like energy this child brings. Is it fire, is it water, or things like that. So I decided to work with water and also to just explore the silence that comes with that. The swishing sound of water, especially just on my tap at the time. And that also zoned into like why I started talking about nature, about the birds in the poem, about the perceived ecological disasters. Some of them I actually watched them during that time when I got tired of seeing the numbers rose from the screen, because almost every time I had my screen on CNN just to see how the numbers kept on climbing at the time. So I feel like it's not a conscious thing that I write about water. It's just like something that I'm more comfortable writing about that, because it allows me to think about many things, because I also think about creation through water. So I think that's the reason for that.
Yeah, thank you. I want to follow up on, that's interesting. It makes sense that you wrote so much of this during COVID, because solitude is such an important part of this book also.
Yes.
Several of the poems talk about khalwa.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
Which means solitude and also refers to like a particular practice of spiritual contemplation.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how that concept or the practice of khalwa informs your poetics?
Yes. So I come from a household of Sufi Muslims. My grandparents were like mystic Sufi Muslims, and there's this tradition of Sufism where people isolate themselves just in a way, in an attempt to be closer to God, to the Creator. And during COVID, because of the isolation that I experienced and how I felt like everyone was just in their rooms, kind of like was similar to that culture of religious seclusion that people on my father's side do, right? So I decided, even though I had nothing, maybe I would say nothing to write about, but when I thought about that correlation between isolation and the spiritual isolation, which is khalwa, I decided to name every poem I wrote at the time after khalwa. So I wrote a poem about a song that I was listening to, then to be a khalwa about that song. There was a time I got a gown, like what we call agbada from my father, because sometimes, at the time, especially when you're leaving home, maybe my father culture, because I cannot say for the whole of Nigeria, but then he likes to give you something, in hope that maybe if you never return home, he wouldn't say you inherit nothing from your father. So there was a day I was so cold I bought the agbada, and I had nothing to write about. So it has like a gown with overflowing sleeves. So I wrote another khalwa, my father's gown. So that's how I said it, because that helps me to just that helps me glue my thoughts together. And also, as someone, I do not write one poem. I don't know how to just write a single poem. It hardly happens. I write in projects, as most people would know. So if I want to write about a particular thing, I like to research and move and push myself to read about things, about issues, so I can write 2-3 poems about the same thing, and that's why I have several poems that are khalwa, khalwa, khalwa. And even in my previous book, I also have a poem that is satellite phone calls, and satellite phone calls. And in the books that will come, you see the same thing.
Yeah. Can you read that poem that you mentioned, khalwa, in my Baba's gown? Yeah.
That's a sign that I'm getting old.
You're walking far again.
Not that old. So Khalwa in my baba's gown. I held the wraps of my sleeve's end between two fingers and twisted them into a rosary for Khalwa. Inside the incense burner, the bahur simmered and filled the room with warm fragrance in silence. I sent grieving eyes. Out of this cotton cape, I untangled the rosary and waved it into a fishnet, even though I was miles away from Sardis. A night before I left Kaduna, Baba reminded me of how my cry almost got them killed months after my birth. Each time he tells this story, it ends in laughter and a prayer for grandfather buried inside a well. A gown's overflowing sleeves were gifts for daring to swim across the sea, bearing scars of losing grandfather to water. I have a long history of resistance, so I watered the aloe vera while in the khalwa. I have enough ointment to erase the scars on my body. I opened my window and stared at the sky with an ignited anger for all I have lost. I know there's a prayer in the silence ensued. The pouch that houses a blade can't withstand its sharpness. So this poem actually, it's more like it's inspired by my grandfather, who's Sheikh, is also an Islamic scholar who traveled to Ghana to just preach Islam. And then he also is a poet, but they write in Arabic. But he was killed. We often have religious crises in Nigeria where like the Christian will go to a dominated Muslim area and then kill some people, and then there's retaliations across. So he happened to be caught in the Christian area at the time, so he was thrown into the well and then buried. So at the time when I was at my father, when my father was trying to call me about the situation of COVID, he just made mention of it, like, because of the several things that the man has done, that he believed that I would outlive the COVID, because what actually happened it seemed like the end of days to him. So that's the inspiration behind this, in line with the Khalwa tradition that I was writing about.
So it's making me think of another poem that mentions Khalwa in a line.
Yeah.
Cosmology of my room is a planet of rosaries is
Page 5.
Page 5.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Has this line beneath this bed of lilies is a well with a rose swing for Khalwa, which struck me because that metaphor is so interesting and complicated, and the image keeps taking these surprising turns.
Yes.
But that's also perhaps a reference to what happened to your grandfather.
Yes.
Which I hadn't realized.
And no.
Yeah.
Yes, because you're right, and no, because the tradition of Khalwa is just to find a place where no one will find you, basically to find God. So there are people who will dig a well where people, a well, and then have a rope where they go inside the well and close themselves in that well for like a few days, just to recite the name of Allah, for reference or like seeking God. So that was like a direct reference to that tradition. But it's actually a lost tradition that even if you search about it on Google, you might not find it. It used to also be a very secretive tradition where people don't talk about the Sufi tradition outside of the Sufi household. So even an outsider would not understand what you're saying. So that's why it's a yes and a no question.
Yeah. It's so interesting to hear the origins of some of these images for you. I also, want to talk about, because there's so much religious imagery, references to prayer, poems that read as prayers.
Yes.
Do you consider yourself a religious poet?
For me, I think poetry is a prayer and a lifeline. So it's both for me. And the reference you get to see, like that reference to maybe I'm a spiritual poet, might arise because the first kind of poems that I learned to read or memorize are actually Arabic poems that are spiritual poems. And up till this moment, I find it difficult to. I've only memorized one poem of mine and I forgot. I can't recite it. But like I have pages of Arabic poems that I can recite any day, anytime. So I feel like maybe it's just that tradition of having to grow up in a household where everyone writes anymore. Because the poems serve a purpose. It's not just for enjoyment, like the Arabic sense of it. It has to be in praise of something worthy, like a prayer. So there are people who, the Arabic poets called the Ashaira, they are like spiritual, they are preachers, but they do their preaching by singing because they feel like people like to dance. So I feel like it's that culture of learning to do all these things that kind of like influence how I write my own English poems. So maybe if there's a church of poetry, which I think someone is already doing, maybe I'm actually a spiritual poet, you know, because I believe in the power of poetry. Poetry has done so much for so many of us. It's changed how we reflect at the world and ourselves. So I feel like, yes, I'm a spiritual poet.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll add that to my bio next time.
I want to ask you about language. So the language of the poems in this book, but also you have more than one first language, and you also translate. So do you have, like, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your process. Do you compose in English always, or Yoruba, or like back and forth, or Arabic, like?
Yes. So I compose my poems in English, most of them, but there are some lines that I find very hard to just get them in English. An example of that is there's just a phrase that says in Yoruba, "Gbangba shata." I don't know how to say that. It's just like saying you have to be a huge bird to want to stand alone. You know, you have to explain it, and in the explanation you lose it. Like it has to be Asha is like an eagle, I would say, but like the lone traveling eagle can survive anywhere. Just that phrase. But people say it casually, and if I want to include that in a poem, there's no way I have to explain it to you that's a bird. And then to a Yoruba person, it's like, what are you saying? It's I kind of like lose everything. So I feel like for me, there are some lines that actually come to me in Yoruba, and that's why sometimes I also just leave them there, because if I try to bring them into the English, my English sense of viewing things, I see that does not make sense to anyone, not to people who are English speakers, and a Yoruba person will not pick and be like, oh, this is nice, like you're saying rubbish, you know. So I do kind of all those. So my translation mostly, I write mostly in English, but my translation is just here and there.
Yeah.
So that's what I do.
What about because I don't know a lot about Yoruba, but I do have a sense that it is in a way that is kind of similar to like Yiddish. Like it's a super heavy imagistic and metaphorical language.
Yeah.
So how does that inform your use of metaphor in poems?
Yeah, I think Yoruba is a tonal language, and it's very metaphorical, as you said. But then the importance of how the sound of it is mostly in the tones. So you don't want to like just say a particular word that if you translate it means entirely different things. So for me, how I work all these things is to just have them side by side sometimes, which is like why I say sometimes I write bilingual poems. I write them in Yoruba and I write them in English. And surprisingly, people would enjoy the English part because you do not know the Yoruba. The Yoruba is not that great, if I'll confess. Yeah, but it's just because, yeah, that's honesty. You know, but like, that's a fact. I try to, at first I wasn't interested in writing my own poems in Yoruba. I wanted to seek out people who write in Yoruba and translate them. But that shared observation that people see you that maybe he's going to make a ton of money. I'll be like, there's no rich poet on earth. The ones that are rich maybe are dead, I don't know. But you don't often make money from poetry that much. So people are kind of like adamant to allow me like translate some of their poems into English because they thought, oh, how much am I going to make? You know, so it's just in that restriction that I get from people, or the hostility towards translating their work, or they feel like I'm going to win Nobel if I translate their work, you know, things like that. So I just decided I would just translate my own work. And I tried to write several poems in Yoruba, but I could only succeed with few of them, so I just stopped there. You know, so that's the motivation for why you see my poems in Yoruba. So it's not because I have to share the most outstanding knowledge for Yoruba, but because I have the zeal to see that something is being done to move the language forward.
How are we on time?
Good.
Okay. So I was looking at some of these poems with my students in class today, and they pointed out something that I thought was really insightful, that a lot of your lines work via contrast. So you'll have these very like frankly bleak subjects next to an image that feels quite hopeful or is really beautiful. And so I wanted to ask you about that. It's all through this book and your first book too. Is that like, where does that come from? Is that deliberate? Are you like, oh, I have to put something a little uplifting in here so people will, you know, or is that just how you?
I think I'm not that conscious of my work. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes I just write and I let the work stay for like months, like years or weeks, and I come back to it sometimes. And it's possible that because of that change of mood at the time when I was editing the work, I'll just like maybe change some things, you know, like this is too bleak, you know, let me just include something. Maybe I do not strive towards hopefulness. I think I strive towards clarity.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you need to give people, it's more like allowing you to step out so you can be more reflective of what's inside. So that's exactly what I try to do with those lines. And it's always interesting when people read your work, because they will always see things you're not intentionally doing or things you do not know that you were doing. So I really appreciate your students for pointing that out. You know?
It's interesting to think about other types of contrasts in your work. You often will do this thing where you have something very small and then like a zoom out where we see the whole earth like from the outside or something. So you're switching scales within a poem often and moving in physical space quite a lot. Sometimes within a single line, sometimes from poem to poem.
I'm happy to know that.
Can we hear a couple more?
Absolutely. That's why I found it. So for people who read my first book, I kind of like curfew. This is the second time I'm having a curfew. I had curfew in my first book. There's another curfew, and that's because there are different kinds of curfew. We had all kinds of curfew. Growing up at the time, almost like in months, there's a curfew for something, curfew for when there's a crisis, there's curfew so people can go home and be hungry, and then maybe people go out again. So I always have that consciousness to write about those experiences. Maybe this is the last time you see curfew in my book, so this is the last curfew. The war began on a school day. I saw men walk around with faces eclipsed by rage and grief. The moon was fatigued by its tower around earth. I was born with hair on my shoulder. Mama said I was Kineo in my previous life. The scar on this forehead is a sign of reincarnation. She told stories to distract us from the dying voices. My mama's eyes was the theater of a man who praised the rusty edge of a blade as they were the gate that leads to a garden of produce. Wrinkles sprouted from the sides of her eyes after the new millennium. Boys my age died in sleep. On the sky that day were the stripes of all 99 shades of red. We walked streets during the curfew in search of florets. And for the first time in weeks, I said a song in praise of my lunchbox. We have all lost something. And in their memories, we held a congregation in Kakuri Market. For once in our history that may go undocumented, our scars flickered, as if caressed by the yellow hands of a sleeping God.
I just want to ask you, because I think in section 2 of this poem, my mama's eye was a theater for men that praised the rusty edge of a blade as they would a gate that leads to a garden of proteas. It's like this layering of images that do this kind of wandering thing, and within those images, like, they're so specific. It's not, so my mama's eye was a theater for men. That's a metaphor. And then we move into the praise the rusty edge of a blade, and then a comparison to that as they would a gate that leads to a garden of proteas, not as they would to a garden of proteas, but as they would a gate, you know? So there's like all of these sort of sections to your metaphors, and like they're like built in these compartments so often, and there's like 5 or 6 of them in one sentence sometimes. So can you, like, how do you construct a thing like that? How do you I'm just so curious about the minds behind these types of lines.
Thank you so much for that question. So for me, I just thought most times some of this magic happens, I would say, during editing, because most times you would have like two pages of like a poem, and then anytime I go back to it, I ask myself, can this line be in this poem? And then that's how I start my subtraction. And then the more I subtract from those lines, the more I try to see correlations between what's going on. So I arrive by method of calculation in poetry. So I calculate some lines, I calculate some words, and I just do it. You know, sometimes I think that's what poetry is about. Sometimes I've read my own work, I'm like, oh my God, this cannot be my word. Like, so I go on Google to search to see if I heard it in my dreams, or like someone said it, or it's someone's work from workshop, right? You know. So like sometimes it happens, but like I think to get into the ideal of arriving at a very concrete metaphors in poems, especially for me, is just to pay attention to what the poem is saying. You know, like what are the many things the poem is not saying. So sometimes you include the things the poems are not saying to help the metaphors grow. Sometimes you don't just want to, because like you don't want to just say the obvious things. And it's in that calculation that I feel like the words would then stand out, the poems would then stand out. You know? And I was surprised by this book actually, because when I was done writing the book, I was like, the book is too short. So I decided I was tired, I was already writing other works, but I decided I would just send it out and see what's going to happen. And I got like, I think I sent it to 3 contests, and it was like finalist. Somewhere. I was like, maybe I should send it elsewhere. And I actually sent it elsewhere, and then when he won this prize, I forgot about taking it down from other places, and he won other 2 contests.
Oh my God.
And you know, and because I had signed this, I'm like, oh my God, can I say no to this? And you know, something like that. And then because you know, so I feel like it's in that glory of saying I pay attention to what the poem I feel like the poem needs. And I feel like also when I met with the publisher, when I see that these are people who are very, very much interested in what I do, and they were direct with what the plans they have. You also saying it about how they set up readings for me to come, which is not something that you get every time. So I think, to go back to your question, for me it's just in that method of doing maths. I add some words, I take out some words, I read them aloud. And also, I was surprised that I didn't get fined from my apartment in Campus Creek, because I had all my poems on the walls. So sometimes I was just in a good mood, and I'd be like, oh, this line does not deserve to be here. Because sometimes we also, as poets, we're sentimental. There are lines that does not need to be in that poem, but I love this line. But there are sometimes I'm like annoyed with something else, and like this line will have to go. You just have to go, you know. In that way, I'm brutal to those poems. I think it's in that brutality to not fear taking out some words that can like allow that packedness that you see in my metaphors. You know, and I believe sometimes like there are poems that are driven by that solid packness of that metaphor, and that are translating into the narrative, which is what I'm planning to do now. Rest in my metaphor veins.
I bet there's plenty of metaphors in the next project. Just guessing. I have one last question, and then maybe can we hear a poem and then open it to audience questions. So, this book starts off in the Mediterranean and it ends in Sardis. And it moves all over the world.
Yes.
And so I was curious about how you think about place in poems, and also why did you choose to end the book in Mississippi?
Because I was in Mississippi. And it was at a time where like everywhere was shut down. So for some of you who know Andy and I and Sadia would go to Sardis Lake in the middle of Sardis, I guess, if you know that. So we'll go to the lake and just sit down there because there are less people. It's just like 2 other people there. And then if you know Sardis, there's this other side of Sardis where there's no one. We just go there and just sit down and just, just chat about nothing, or just, just talk to ourselves because it was already getting darker because the COVID wasn't going to stop, I guess, at the time. I think it's still around. So I decided to end it in Mississippi because I think Mississippi is so important to me and also to this project. As I said, I told you, I didn't have time to explore Mississippi, like other parts of Mississippi, except breakfast here and there, and that I had gyros rancheros, which is a food that I will not forget, even though I don't like it, but I love the name. This is something I think was the first thing that came to my mind coming to the US, is the fact that there's so many, the food has luxurious names, but it doesn't taste as luxurious as I think. So I think about places through food, through culture, but I so much love the quietude that I got from Mississippi, and also the support from everyone of you, friends, family, mentors, to continue just writing. You get that as though you have a permission to write about this place because you're here now, you've been to Ole Miss, and I just felt, I think the writing about place specifically of Mississippi is because I felt at home here, and that's why I wrote about Mississippi. But the idea of place changes for me. The Nigeria that I left at the time that I left was not the same. Even though if I go back now, I'm not going to make the same thing. So I feel like poetry has helped me to document those places, so I can also like embalm the memories of those places and how I left them. So even if anything changed in my absence, it's not mine to write about, but I can only document the things that I left behind. So that's why I felt like place is very much important to me. And even in all my books, maybe the coming one is also a sense of place. I hope I answered that.
Yeah, so all of your place poems are also elegies to those places?
Yes, of some sort.
Yeah, yes. It's really beautiful.
And I also have a poem, another poem about Sardis, because I love the place. At the time, it was a relief to be there. Every time we go there, I think we go there quite some time. We go there. Except one day we had a gunshot, and then I told Sadia, maybe they just practicing. He said, "We need to go." Aside that one time, it's a lovely place to go. You should all go to Sadia sometime. I write some poems. Thank you so much.
Yeah, let's hear one more.
So I'll read one more poem. One more. I actually love this book too. I was trying to choose some poems that I'll read Not to brag, but then I have so many things to do. So I'll just read Bat. Bat. What song would you render on the eve of another storm? In this prayer house, birds perched on the speaker beside the pulpit. I believe they could hear us, unlike the old days we spoke in tongues to reconnect our ancestors. But I don't know what God made of it. This was the earliest miracle I knew. They were without food for 3 days, and they left at almost the same time, after Maghrib prayer. I still don't know what bats eat. I was relieved when the bats flew out the window, back into the night sky, where every miracle belongs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Do
you.
y'all have questions for Hussain?
I hope you don't mind me asking this. I believe that you appreciate Mississippi and have been happy to be here when you were here.
Absolutely.
And you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I'm wondering what it was like for you to first come to the United States, but specifically to knowing Africa's history and Mississippi's history and the things those two histories involve. What that was like for you, and why your mother let you come.
I think I was blinded by my own dreams, at first. Thank you for that question. I remember when I was Derek who called to say, you've not replied us. And I said, replied you for what? And he said, you got the admission into the program. I was like, oh my God, I already got in somewhere. But I was so happy because at the time I'd read Amy's work specifically. So it's like, oh my God, I'm going to see Amy. And then my dad called me and said, are you sure? This is not some sort of scam. And I said, it's not. I have friends in MFA. He was just not like, why? Then he asked, he said, what will you be doing when you get to Mississippi? And I said, maybe some teaching assistantship. And then he said, you get paid? I said, yes. He said, are you that good? So I said, yes, I guess. So he was just like prayerful. And then my mom would say they need to pray for me so things would go wrong. And because of the time zone, what's it called again? The time difference. While I traveled from Frankfurt to Mississippi to Houston, then to Memphis, and that was like already 2 days in Nigeria, I think. And then my mom was so worried. They had called me when I got to my apartment in Saddle Creek. That was the first place I lived. I had like 40 missed calls because they thought I got lost somewhere in space or like maybe something somehow. This was not real. But I feel like that passion to go to write poems, to study under professors who've done the work, including with Melissa, also Ann Fisher, there's Ben Ann. It's just like the caliber of those people is enough to convince anyone that you're doing the right thing. And if they've gone this far, they've done wonders with the miracles of word and poetry. I think that motivation just kept me going. So I wasn't so worried. And I guess what you mean is about maybe racism and all that. To be very frank, in Nigeria we have this issue. I do not see, like this culture of smiling to people. When people see you and they smile. The first time someone smiled at me, I thought maybe she was one of those students in my class. And I walked again and someone did like this, like, why are they smiling? That was like the shock to me, So I wasn't worried about the racial part of it. Is when I see another black person, I'm very slow at saying racism. I have to be with people who say, oh, this person is disrespecting you, to learn. So I learned that here. So many people here, especially Nigerians, we don't know because there's 200 million black people in Nigeria. So there's no way I'll look at another black person and be like, this person is inferior. There's no way, I just see elegance everywhere. You know what I mean? So, and that's just not, there's no distinction by people's color but I can say, no, you're not my religion, because that's how we do division in Nigeria. So I wasn't so much, there's no much worry about racism, but people actually talk about Mississippi, because even in Cincinnati, when I tell people I've been to Mississippi, like, oh my God, you've been to Mississippi. You know how there's a way they call, and then I'll be like, what's a cool place? And then they say, tell me about it. It's more like you're talking about the end of the, like Mississippi is just a state that is just the end of the world, right? But I enjoy my experience here. I've never been. This is not to say that it's not. It has no fault, but I have not experienced anything here. So I love the place. I love the experience. Even though it was COVID, everyone was silent. I was confident enough to go to the lake because I feel confident. Yes, I feel if you're asking about the worries, I have no worry about Mississippi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
More questions? Yeah.
This will be a somewhat easy one, but somewhat selfish as well,
Okay.
because I brought my current graduate poetry workshop to the reading.
Thank you for coming.
And of course. But I wanted to ask you if you can think back to first year Hussain, before you ever took a workshop. What would you tell that young man now as like advice? Like, make sure you do such and such, in workshop, or, don't stress out about whatever. Like, what advice could you give to people who are, brand new to the program or still in the program, things like that? Now that you are on your way to a PhD, that kind of thing, what advice would you give to the students here studying poetry?
I think you're not going to buy Bentley in poetry workshop. But on a more serious note, I feel like the advice I would give is to say that you know what you're doing with your own work. There are times when the advice you get, the feedback you get from your student, from your colleagues, are even more useful sometimes than the one you get from your professors. And sometimes the professors give more useful feedback. Not to say that everyone they mean evil by the kind of feedback they give, but to say that you need to know who's reading you rightly. Like this person gets what I'm trying to do, because you might be writing about a particular thing, and I do not get it, and I'll be giving you advice based on my own experience of what you've read out to me. And if you have sat for like weeks or many hours just writing a particular poem, it might be very difficult for a person who just read it for like 2 hours before the workshop to give you a more accurate feedback. So this is to say that you don't have to take all advice from feedback from people, but you also do not have to take it to heart. Because for me, people would say, oh, I don't like this line. I'd be like, okay, but I like it. Sometimes I feel like you can have that. So I have that stubbornness sometimes. And sometimes it is when maybe a poem is already accepted, I'm like, oh my God, this person in class told me this about this particular line. And it's that time you feel like you need to change it. It's possible that people are already miles ahead of you. Already professors are miles ahead of you, I guess. But there are colleagues, I feel like there are some of my colleagues that are miles ahead of me in some ways, in like structure of poems, not just the theme. So I get to listen to people and not just work on the advice they give or feedback immediately. Let it sit there, let it sit for some while, and then come back to it. Because sometimes when people tell you the truth, even though you know it's the truth, but it kind of like gets into you. So like, I feel like don't let feedback get into you. Write your poems and dream big. Do not stop writing because the works are not accepted elsewhere. Just keep doing the work. Because for me, at the time, the time when I even do not submit anywhere, I just keep writing and writing and writing. And I wake up one day and like, oh my God, I've got like 150 pages of poems sometimes. So I feel like if you keep doing the work, you'll get there someday. And then maybe you write about things you love, even if there's no one who loves the same thing. So I think that's the advice I would give a young me. That's it. And also maybe go to visit professors, just chill with them sometimes, and ask questions, normal questions,
Only normal questions.
Because there are times I think we hang out outside classroom. Those you can ask abnormal questions if you want to. But like work-related questions, ask about recommendations. There are times you write about a project, but in your mind, in your very young mind, you think, I'm doing the best thing after the invention of Coca-Cola. And the professor will tell you, no, it's a lie. There's several books about these things, you know. And this is not to say we cannot do it, because I feel poetry is all repetition. Whatever I have in this book has been written about before, but this is me, the me version of this work. And there are people, young poets, who come after me, who write about service in a very much elaborate way, in a very much unique way. So I feel like it's all repetition in a way, as Hussain Ahmed would say. The effect of that repetition is not that effect that the repetition would have is what keeps poetry going. It's not like, and someone would say it's like a prophecy. You know? So I feel like we should just keep doing what we like to do.
Great advice.
Thank you so much for asking.
Do we have time for one more? No.
Yes, sir.
One last question?
I got
Sure.
If you would,
Yes.
other than English, I'm curious about what other languages you know,
Yeah.
and is being multilingual, is that useful in your poetry, or do you play with other languages
Yes.
in the course of writing in English too?
Yes. Thank you for that question. So I speak this English that you hear me speak. I speak the Pidgin English, which is a Creole Nigerian English. I also speak Hausa, I speak Yoruba, and I speak Arabic. But because Arabic is not so fluently now, because there's no one to speak Arabic with, so I'm kind of like losing it, but I speak Arabic. And I also use almost all of those in my poems. And this is because poetry used to be my first medium of poetry. Arabic, sorry, used to be my first medium of poetry, because as I said earlier, I grew up in a religious background where we had to memorize these poems. And these are poems that talks about the human value, you know, how to be religious, how to care for the elderly, how to respect people. These are what the poems are about. So I read in Arabic, I memorize poems in Arabic, but not in English. But I write in English and all other languages. I also have, I think there's a form that I wrote, Yoruba Disdarian, which is, we had a class with Amy where you write, I think, two lines of an Disdarian, like in a week. Is it like that? So after that, I decided that since I have the patience to go through this task, I would just write a Disdarian, but with the Yoruba alphabet. So I think that's also an influence. There are also some of my lines that are directly Yoruba lines, and I do not translate them into English, because I feel like they will lose the quality if I do translate them. And there are sometimes that I also write in English. Sorry, Hausa. But I hardly write in Arabic, but I memorize Arabic poems. So I feel like it's a collage of many things in me. So thank you for that question.
Okay, Hussain, thank you so much for reading and talking with me today, and congratulations on this beautiful book, and congratulations on your beautiful daughter. Hussain has a new baby girl.
Thank you so much everyone for coming, friends and community members, and to Amy for bringing the class to this reading space, and to my friends, and to Off Square Books for allowing me to come talk about poetry, and to everyone. Thank you. You could have been elsewhere, but you decided to hear some poems. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.